Hello, I'm Alessandra Kelley, professional fine artist and rock disintegrator. Everything humans do is art. The caves of Lascaux have so much going on, I can't possibly do them justice in a single video. Consider this an introduction, the beginning of all art everywhere since time began, and will probably be coming back later. In the late Paleolithic, approximately 18,000 years ago, give or take a millennium, a group of nomadic people in what is now the south of France spent considerable time painting figures of animals in a cave complex now called La Grotte de Lascaux, the Lascaux Cave, high up in the Dordogne River Valley. These people didn't live in the cave, they were a nomadic people moving in a circuit from place to place. They did use some shallow caves as shelters, but the deep, hidden, decorated caves like Lascaux, although full of art, never were living spaces. They painted large mammals, horses and bulls, deer and bison. There's a single figure interpreted as a human in a style very different from most of the art there, which might be a late addition. The artists of Lascaux used some pretty sophisticated methods, including flint line scratchers, cut leather stencils, airbrush-type bone blowers, some sort of brushes, and moss and fur daubers. They used locally sourced and possibly imported pigments. Some of the images are enormous and placed high up, requiring scaffolding to support the artists as they worked. Some of the images are in cave areas that can only be reached by ladders and ropes. This is carefully planned, mature, sophisticated work. Some of the images have been painted over, and some of them have been added to. There's an ordering to them, but we don't know what it means. We can make educated guesses, but we have to be careful that we don't impose our preconceptions of what we think we're looking at. We need to see honestly what's there without twisting it or redrawing it, without overwriting it to fit our expectations, which has been known to happen. So, it is almost 19,000 years ago, well before the end of the Ice Age. Glaciers still cover North America and Europe almost down to the 45th parallel, and this part of France is pretty much the northernmost extent of habitable land in Western Europe. The people who live just south of the glaciers at the edge of the world, a culture we call the Solutrean, are nomadic hunter-gatherers. They're healthier than later farming peoples, tall, robust, sturdy, and long-lived. It's one of those weird ironies of history that agriculture made people's lives collectively better but individually worse. With farms, you could support a larger population on a worse diet with more health problems than their sturdy nomadic hunter-gatherer ancestors. The Solutreans were dark-skinned and dark-eyed. The mutations for pale skin and blue eyes are surprisingly recent. They didn't happen until a whole 10 to 14,000 years after the caves were painted, and seem to have been a side effect of the development of agriculture. Turns out a mostly starchy farm-grown diet will kill you if you can't get enough vitamin D from the sun. Back in the Solutrean, 18 to 19,000 years ago, the people of the south of France ate a high-quality, high-protein diet dominated by reindeer meat. They used reindeer bones and antlers to make artifacts and art. They scoffed a lot of reindeer. There were so many reindeer remains found in their encampments that when their culture was first identified and described by archaeologists Edouard Latte and Henry Christie in 1875, the two men dubbed it l'âge du renne, the age of the reindeer. And oh boy, did the Solutrean people make art. Between them and the slightly later Magdalenian people, we have found hundreds of caves with thousands of images across France and Spain, and hundreds of thousands of artworks and artifacts made from any number of durable materials: stone, flint, fired clay, bone, shell, and antler, which these people carved, molded, and engraved into beads, tools, animals, and human figures. The overwhelming majority of the human figures are women, which is kind of interesting, and most of the parts are basically women's genitals. There are hints that there were plenty of more ephemeral artworks made from perishable materials lost to us, fragments of spun fibers and clay impressions of woven fabrics and basketry. We have some evidence of the sorts of garments they made and used. That hasn't stopped people from guessing. From Victorian artists to people in the Jazz Age, there are paintings with all sorts of speculation about what cave people might have dressed like. But you have to remember, there is zero evidence for any of that. It's based on Victorian cultural assumptions, endlessly repeated and never challenged. We know better now, but it's hard to shift cultural attitudes once they get set. Burials discovered in the last century tell us a lot, as do figurines. We know they sewed because we found the needles. We know they made music because we found bone flutes and clay rattles. The Solutrean people in particular are known for their exquisite flint and bone tools made with advanced techniques lost to later peoples. Lascaux lies along the Dordogne River Valley in the south of France, an area of limestone riddled with caves. Lascaux itself is considerably farther upriver than most of the caves, in a relatively flat, gentle, high plateau. The thing to remember is this is a cave. Its walls, although they are a relatively white limestone, are not neither smooth nor flat. Some of them are crusted. They undulate, they bulge, they turn this way and that. They're quite a complex surface. The artists at Lascaux used that complexity. They placed their paintings relative to the shape of the rock face, sometimes making it a part of the animals depicted, sometimes using it to give a sense of looming over you, sometimes making it so you had to move around to see the entire painting. It's a remarkably sophisticated use of the available surface and space. Okay, so art materials. Paints are made from pigment and binder. Binder is also called medium. Pigment, a physical powder, supplies the color. Pigments have been historically made from naturally occurring colored clays, ground minerals, and metal oxides. Binder makes the pigment stick together and stick to whatever surface it's applied to. Without a binder, the pigment is as fragile and ephemeral as chalk on a sidewalk. Interestingly, the Lascaux artists did not mix their pigments with any binder except water. Applied to just damp underground limestone, wet pigment pastes would semi-dry into something like a chalk drawing with just enough humidity to keep it from crumbling away. If the art is in a quiet, still place where rain and wind don't happen, it can last a very long time, as kind of is demonstrated by the caves themselves. The Lascaux artists used pure pigments mixed to pastes with water to make their art. I have jars of this stuff in my studio. I may have some of the same pigments the cave painters used. France and Spain are both famous to this day for their red and yellow ochres, which are clay deposits colored with iron oxides. Ochres naturally occur in a broad range of yellows, golds, oranges, browns, and reds. Manganese black also occurs naturally. All of these pigments have been identified in the caves of Lascaux. The artists used a variety of techniques to apply the pigments. Sticks of pure pigment gave sharp lines. Brushes of some unidentified form gave almost as sharp lines. Fur, moss, or textile pads made blobs and blotches and absorbed drips when they were using brushes. Wet paint blown through hollow bones gave an airbrush effect. They even used stencils, probably made from leather, for pre-shaped sharp edges. Some historians say the artists may have blown the paint out of their mouths, but here's the thing. That's gross. That's gross. It's difficult to control. It's difficult to aim. It makes a mess of the person. It's unwieldy. It's difficult to clean up. And we know they had hollow bone blower tools because we found them with the paint still in them. The blower method is pretty cool. Stick one hollow bone into a container of liquid pigment like a straw. Put another in your mouth. Blow through that one sideways across the top of the first bone, and the lowered air pressure sucks the pigment right up, and the air you're blowing sprays it forward. This technique was still being used when I went to art school to mouth blow fixative onto chalk and charcoal drawings. The wet paint never gets near you or your mouth. No gross mouth mess is made, you can aim really well, you can control your paint, and you can blow way more paint than you can ever fit in your mouth at any one time. There's no reason, even using Stone Age tech, to ever put gross wet clay pigment into your mouth. Not to be rude or anything, but I think art historians might be well served by a semester or two of practical studio experience before they start making weird, uninformed guesses about art techniques. So what did the Lascaux artists paint? Well, here's where it gets interesting. There are some 6,000 figures of animals, the majority of which are horses. There's a much smaller number of abstract signs, and one single ambiguous figure of which much is made, which is probably a human, although its style is very different from the animals. The critters were native to the area at the time. According to the Michelin Guide, most of the animals depicted are female and pregnant. Horses are the most common animals shown, found everywhere in the caves. Next most common are stags and aurochs, which is to say wild cattle, in equal numbers, then ibexes and bison. There are a few big cats and bears, mostly tucked away in out-of-the-way corners or almost hidden. What there are not are any reindeer, which is kind of weird. We know these people hunted and ate more wild reindeer than any other kind of large game, and yet there's not a single reindeer among all the thousands of animals depicted in the Cave of Lascaux. Indeed, there are hardly any reindeer in any of the cave art of France and Spain. How the figures were painted is significant too. The horses in Lascaux, for example, were all painted in the same way, and it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect. The first part of the horse the artist would paint was always the mane. Next came the neck and the color of the body, the hide. Then the lines that define the edges, the back, the belly, the legs, the head, and the tail. Every horse image in Lascaux that has been examined follows this ordering: first mane, then skin, then edges. This is almost the opposite of standard modern thinking. We outline first, then color in. If the cave wall was smooth, the artists used brushes or sticks of pigment to outline the horses. If it was rough, crusty, or uneven, the lines were blown with the bone blowing tool. You can see the use of stencils in some places. We think those were cut out of leather. There are horses with engraved outlines in the nave part of the cave. They follow the same painting order as the fully painted ones: mane first, the color of the hide next, and the outline last. Just in this case, the outline was engraved instead of drawn. This method doesn't vary over generations, maybe hundreds of years. Recently, Lascaux researchers discovered that when there are panels with multiple kinds of animals, they're always put down in the same order. Horses first, then bulls and cows, then deer. Occasionally a bear or something might slip in somewhere. I haven't seen any sources that give a clear sense of the scale of timing on these paintings. It could be that the artists painted horses one day and bulls the next, but it could also be that the horses were painted one year and the bulls in a later one, or even by a later generation. We don't know. The paintings were made in a relatively short period of time for cave art, but that could still be like 2,000 years. So what did the 19th century critics who discovered or rediscovered Paleolithic cave art think it was for? A theory popular with some French academics was that it wasn't anything but decoration, either the purest of art for art's sake or mere wallpaper, depending on your philosophical stance. The problem with this theory, of course, is that the artworks were made in some very peculiar, difficult-to-reach places. If these images were just decoration, why go to all the trouble to spelunk deep into a nearly inaccessible cave to make them? And if the artists only copied what they saw, why didn't they paint reindeer or birds, plants, or insects, or other things that were part of their world? Probably the most popular theory about what the Paleolithic cave art is about is that it's part of some sort of hunting ritual. Let's look at the context of where that idea came from. Paleolithic art was rediscovered in the mid-19th century at a moment when the Industrial Revolution was modernizing Western civilization. Nationalism was in resurgence. Pop culture was chock full of romantic historical cosplay, and seemingly every country was trying to discover, wrangle, or invent a colorful, glorious, and romantic past for itself. In a world that was turning urban and industrial, hunting off in some semblance of wilderness was considered the most manly of sports. 19th century men, or at least 19th century men of the social classes who became archaeologists and paleontologists, romanticized hunting and held the then fashionable notion that the only history that counted was made by men with weapons in their hands. Men with power and money were building pseudo-historical fantasy hunting lodges left and right, and these men freely and confidently projected their interests and perspectives backwards in time. So when mid-19th century explorers found caves full of beautiful, detailed depictions of bulls and bison and horses and other wild animals, their first thoughts seemed to have turned to popular notions of hunting and hunting trophies. The idea of the caves as some sort of hunting lodge come trophy hall come magic shooting gallery fit well with their own tastes in entertainment and their romantic notion of primitive man wrestling with nature, red in tooth and claw. It also fit into pseudo-Darwinian ideas that were floating around at the time. The idea caught on in the public imagination, and it's never really gone away. Mention cave art even today, and most people will picture it as some sort of hunting sympathetic magic with men in fur diapers waving spears at shooting gallery silhouettes of mastodons or something like that. There are problems with the theory that the caves are about hunting rituals. The main one is that the animals depicted were not what the people hunted for the most part. For thousands of years, their main prey was reindeer, and there is not a single depiction of reindeer anywhere in Lascaux. If cave art were partially or entirely about hunting, one would expect to find some images of what they hunted. When women were identified as being present in the caves, some people turned around and took it as evidence that women were also hunters. Wait, women were present? Ah, yes. Here's something interesting. Paleolithic people left handprints in the caves, thousands of them, stenciled and outlined, and recent studies suggest you can tell men's handprints from women's. On average, women have longer index fingers than ring fingers, and men have longer ring fingers than index fingers. Measurements of the hands in Paleolithic cave art suggest that at least 75% of them are identifiably female. People also left their footprints in the caves, and while you can't tell the gender of a person from a footprint, you can see the size. There are footprints of babies and small children, and larger footprints, probably the artists. Babies were in the caves, and little kids. But get this, men were not. Wait, what? To be more precise, While there is evidence for lots of people smaller than adult men in the decorated late Paleolithic French caves, all the way down to babies, there is little to no evidence for anyone as large as an adult man. None of these footprints, not anywhere in these caves, are big enough to belong to adult men. You might think that if the artists can't possibly have been men, then they must have been women. Oddly enough, that is not the conclusion the archaeologists and anthropologists came to. See, for 200 years, there's been a vision of the past built up that, well, let me show you. In the texts I've read, the Ice Age people were described as having gender-divided roles, men doing the hunting and weapon making, and women keeping the hearths going, sewing the clothes, bearing and rearing and teaching the children, catching the fish, crafting the crafts, making the art, and gathering and cooking the food. In other words, classic gender role division as defined by Europeans in the 19th century. We may not actually have evidence that the tasks were divided up anything like that, and there may be no reason to assume that only men knapped flints and only women sewed textiles, but that's always been the way the illustrations swung. The old Victorian image of cave men artists has been firmly lodged in everyone's thinking since Victoria's reign, and assumptions that old don't go away just because evidence says they're impossible. And so, since men and older teenage boys clearly did not make this art, it had to have been made by adolescent teenage boys. Oh dear. This, by the way, is why so much writing about cave art speaks of adolescence as being so very important part of it. Children and adolescents, teenagers, youths, and boys. It's because the authors can't talk about men because men were not present. But listen, there are a few human footprints, maybe 30,000 years old, found deep in Chauvet Cave, universally described as belonging to a boy 8 or 10 years old exploring with his faithful dog. But remember, you can't tell gender from a footprint. These footprints are reportedly just over 9 inches long and 3.5 inches wide. This is almost exactly the size of my feet, a grown-ass woman. These are the kind of feet that leave footprints that rule out men as the cave artists. These are the feet of grown women who do perfectly well at exploring caves and making art and domesticating dogs. Thank you very much. I mean, yes, many books and publications have shifted, if sometimes a little uncomfortably, to the notion that, well, perhaps the artists were women after all, at least some of them. But to this day, books and journals and articles still make the case for how adolescent boys must be the presumptive artists, suggesting that magnificent, carefully planned, and delicate art is the result of underground, drug-fueled rave-ups, or bored youths making graffiti, or just plain porn. Surely it makes more sense that the artists were relatively small-footed, grown women who kept at it through maturity and experienced old age. If you look at the possibility that it was women who made most Paleolithic cave art, it makes sense. The overwhelming percentage of female figurines and the ubiquitous women's birthing organs would not then be prehistoric porn, but self-portraits of people, the people who made the art. If we have to come up with a narrative explanation for Paleolithic art, this seems to me to at least fit the evidence. Even if we think we're not making stories, we still have more than a century of assumptions and cultural baggage shaping what we expect to find and how we think of cave art and the people who made it. Our image of the cave painters is still where it was more than a century ago. Unexamined associations still shape our understanding and our thoughts, even when we think we're just looking objectively. If we want to honestly find out what was going on with the Lascaux artists, we have to look objectively and mistrust our assumptions. Thanks for listening. So yeah.